Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Just give some time for more people to join. I see everyone's trickling in. All right, so it's 12:02, so we'll get started in the interest of time. So good afternoon and happy Wednesday, everyone. Thank you for joining. Today's seminar series topic will be on mental health of urban search and rescue firefighters. We have Dr. Christopher Weidlich, and Dr. Natasha Schaefer-Solly, and they will be presenting. So a little bit of background. Dr. Weidlich is an assistant professor of clinical and a nurse scientist at the University of Miami. His research focuses on resiliency in military healthcare providers, insomnia treatment of service members with PTSD and substance abuse, and the mental health concerns of urban search and rescue firefighters. His previous work focuses on burnout and PTSD of military and civilian healthcare providers. He is an Army veteran who commanded several medical units both in the US and Iraq. And in 2017, he retired from the US Army Nurse Corps as a lieutenant colonel. So as you all know, Dr. Natasha Schaefer-Solly, she is our research assistant professor at the University of Miami and the co-deputy director of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. Her research interests focus on occupational cancer risk and improving cancer screening in underserved communities. She leads multiple projects within FCI to develop methods of education about prevention and early detection of active and retired firefighters. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we will be responding to all of the questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over and begin our presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be presenting today. I know usually I'm the moderator, so I'm happy to be on the other side of the screen and presenting on a new pilot project that we've been working on in the last year and a half in FCI, looking at mental health concerns of urban search and rescue firefighters. And like most of our studies, this was something that was brought to us by our firefighter partners and collaborators. And it really is something that stemmed after the Surfside building collapse. And it's really, a group of firefighters that we realized that we weren't studying. And so it's something that we wanted to do some formative work and get some information on the overall experiences, both physical and mental, of the USAR firefighters. So I was really lucky to have found Dr. Weidlich from the School of Nursing, who, as you heard, has a great background and depth in PTSD, mental health, a veteran himself of the military. So Chris, would you like to introduce yourself or say anything else?
Yeah, good afternoon. My name's Chris. Again, thank you to Tara and everybody for the nice introduction. Yeah, I was asked by Natasha. She pitched this idea, and I really think it's something that really needs to be explored further. And I think from the presentation today, you're going to see that on some of our preliminary findings that we think we have a plan to move forward to ultimately take care of firefighters and first responders and USAR members. And that's our overall goal.
Great. So I will start us off. So today's presentation, we're going to give a little bit of background about USAR firefighters and what is required of them and what specific tasks go into different deployments. Chris will then take the lead and give us a background on first responders and overall mental health. And then I will give a overview of our pilot study of FCI USAR mental health concerns in our USAR firefighters. And then we'll talk a little bit about future directions and where we'd like to see this work go, and how we can collaborate and continue to work with our partners in the state of Florida as well as nationally to make some changes with our USAR task force members. So I want to talk a little about what is urban search and rescue and how is it defined. So it was established under the authority of FEMA in 1989, and it's a framework for organizing federal, state, and local partner emergency response teams as integrated federal disaster response task force. So as many of you have seen, and most recently with Hurricane Ian, we have seen those USAR members being deployed to help different communities during a time of emergency response. As we learned with Surfside, and really it was during that time that here with our group that we learned a lot about what goes into a deployment and what is required of USAR members, and how from a FEMA and national standpoint, how everyone comes together and the different task forces help out, and also goes in different waves of deployments and timing. Also, you can see that the task forces can be deployed by FEMA to a disaster area to provide assistance in structural collapse, rescue, and they may be pre-positioned when a major disaster threatens a community. So again, these are two prime examples that have happened in the last 2 years, really in our backyard. One being the building collapse at Surfside, which is right here in Miami-Dade County, which we'll speak a little bit more about. And we know that our brothers and sisters in Miami-Dade and City of Miami were initial response members that responded to that and to the Surfside building collapse. And then we also know with disasters such as Hurricane Ian, task forces were sent prior to the hurricane coming down as well as after. And so we see that with these groups, it's both before, after, and during that they're helping out different communities. And so what are some of the things that, when we were researching this a little more and trying to find out, what really goes into a USAR team and what are some of the tasks? So one being conduct physical search and rescue operations in collapsed buildings, provide emergency medical care to trapped victims, utilize search and rescue dogs to find survivors of the collapse, assess and control utilities and hazardous materials, and then lastly, evaluate and stabilize damaged structures. While this is not an exhaustive list, I know there's more, a lot more tasks that go into it, but this is what was listed under FEMA as some of the main tasks. And so when we started this, we really looked in the literature and where we can see there is literature on the estimates of prevalence of PTSD among firefighters. We see range from 8 to 22%, as well as seeing a prevalence of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts among firefighters, also relatively high in a range of 25 to 44%. However, when we do a literature search, we don't see anything specific to the USAR firefighters. And this is really what sparked our interest in really understanding this group. Because as we saw on the previous slide, one of their main duties is, searching and rescuing and searching for bodies. So things that obviously not only are putting them at physical harm, but also causing mental stress as well, as we saw in the Surfside collapse, as well as other deployments such as Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Ian, a lot of hurricanes that we've spoken to different USAR members. And so this is really what led to the development of this proposed study on mental health concerns of our USAR firefighters. And so I'll hand it off to Chris, and he's going to talk a little bit about background on overall mental health and our first responders.
Thanks, Natasha. That's first I got to say thank you all very much to all of you online, because I am a not only have I served and worked mental health with the military, but I have utmost respect for what you do. I'm someone who graduated Cape Coral High School, so I have a lot of friends who are impacted by EN, and I tried to help out from here. And I also lived through Andrew in Miami, so I get seen firsthand being on the receiving end of your work. So with anything we do, whether it's nursing, first responders, anybody, and who takes care of others, sometimes we see some things that are just horrific. And that's part of our job. That's something that we expect to see, and we try to save as many lives as we can. But often we're not able to. So this trauma that we experience puts a burden on us, where you have some kind of pressure, and it may be subtle. It may be something you don't realize at the time. It might not become an issue for a week or two, and then you might start getting things like insomnia or irritability, things that you can't put a finger on. So this trauma experienced, you get a burden out of it. And then in order for you to continue to do your job, you have to best deal with the feelings you have and cope with it before you can help take care of others fully. So that's kind of the background that I go from. Next slide. So ironically, I was doing a literature search and I looked up Benedict Fullerton in Ursono. I've actually worked with Dave Benedict. He was a forensic psychiatrist in the Army. Great person. But he published an article back in 2007 looking at mental health experiences of specific first responders. And he basically categorized everybody into 3 phases. Out of all the first responders that he looked at in his study, a majority of the people experienced some mild transient distress from their experience, such as sleep disturbances, fear, worry, anger, or sadness. And a lot of times people don't realize this themselves. You might hear it from your loved one more than you recognize it in yourself. If you're more irritable, your loved one might say something to you, but you really, it's mild. And so, but most people return to normal function without any treatment. But it would help to, have some community-wide support, maybe some educational interventions in there to kind of bolster your emotional response and help you move forward. Out of all those people, a smaller group might not have mild changes, but they're going to have more moderate symptoms, such as persistent insomnia that lasts over a month, or severe anxiety, or to the point where they have changes in their travel patterns or workplace behavior. For example, as a vet, I will tell you, after I got back from Iraq, I didn't want to go to the big mall with a lot of people around me. I tried to avoid going to those public spaces because it can put me on edge. So that's when you have your experience give you a little more moderate symptoms that you still need to work through over time. But that group, a smaller subgroup, may develop a psychiatric illness such as PTSD or major depressive disorder, and they're going to require some more specialized treatment. And often you see things with PTSD is one way, since PTSD is an anxiety disorder. People don't like feeling anxious. So what they do is they try to cope with their anxiety, usually on their own. And one of the ways they try to do that is self-medication through alcohol or pills. And that can open up a whole new problem for that individual as well. Next slide. So of the firefighters that were mentioned before, the first responders in mental health, they were looked at. Some of the things that predicted an increase in suicidal ideations on first responder firefighters were people of a lower rank in service, less time in service, a pre-existing cancer diagnosis. They were assigned to an all-volunteer department, or their department provides EMS, which makes sense because your department's going to be sending out ambulance crews more, and responding to suicides. So these kind of risk factors tend to increase the likelihood of suicidal ideations showing up in this population. Next slide. So several studies looking at firefighters have commonly found rates of PTSD ranging anywhere from 13 to 18% following a large-scale event, such as Surfside building collapse. It's going to vary some. I know the first responders at 9/11 was probably higher. But not, you can't make that judgment either. They're apples and oranges and different tragedies that have happened. But based on our experiences and what you see, and those things that you go through at the time, they can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I mentioned PTSD a few times, so it's important for me to kind of go by what PTSD is defined as, and to that we use the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, 5th edition. And what it does is it details the common features of a mental health condition. So with PTSD, you have to meet certain criteria. The first one is criterion A. You have to be exposed to an actual threat, or the actual or threatened death, some kind of serious injury or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: either directly witnessing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the events as it occurs, learning that traumatic events occurred close to a family member or close friends. In that case, someone might case actual threatened death of a family member. It has to be violent. So those sorts of things are one of the first criteria that you have to be diagnosed with PTSD. Next slide. In addition, you need to have the presence of one or more of the following intrusive symptoms, or things that sneak up on you, associated with the event. And this happens after the traumatic event occurred. It's such things as a recurrent involuntary or intrusive memory. So you're having memories where you're replaying it in your mind and it's upsetting, and it happens over and over again. Or you're having dreams in which the dream might be related to the trauma and it's distressing you, causing nightmares. You can have dissociative actions where you're kind of feeling an out-of-body experience, or you're having flashbacks where maybe there was a certain smell from the generators of diesel fuel or something, and then you go a year or two later, you smell that same fuel from another generator. It makes you think right back to, let's say, Surfside. So these are dissociative reactions. There's also an intense, prolonged psychological distress. So, and marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize an aspect of the traumatic event. You'll see that a lot with veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, when they would have hear a loud noise like a car backfire or balloon pop. A lot of people would instinctively just physically move, freeze, or hit the ground, because we were trained that that's what happens. You hear a pop, you think it's gunfire, so your instincts kick in. So that physiological reaction still occurs by an external cue, something you smell, something you hear, or something that makes you rethink the traumatic event. Next slide. And then persistence avoidance of stimuli associated with a traumatic event. So maybe you don't want a vacation in South Florida because it has too many bad memories of Surfside, for example, or Hurricane Ian recently. Or you don't want to go into certain buildings where certain areas like parking garages, other structures. So there's something that you're trying to avoid, so you don't bring up the memories, thoughts, or feelings. And you avoid these things. You actually make effort to avoid people, places, and things that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings. Next slide. Now, also with PTSD and the DSM, you have to have some negative thoughts. So negative thoughts and moods associated with the traumatic event. So you might not remember things like, you might not remember specifics of the event. They call it a dissociative amnesia, where you were there, you lived it, but you're missing blocks of time that you just can't recall. And the theory is it's just too painful to try to remember, and your body's blocked it out. A lot of times it's subconscious. We don't know we did it. But you have to have that amnesia is one of the signs. You also have to have negative beliefs or expectations of yourself or others. You have guilt. You're bad. Weren't able to save as many people as you want, so you're beating yourself up. You have some kind of distortion about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event that people blame themselves for. You might want to blame yourself for something that, oh, if I only did this, or only if I had stopped on the way down, I could have gotten there a few minutes earlier and we might have had a different outcome. So we actually our brain plays tricks on us. And then sometimes people have persistent negative emotional state. Anger, fear, guilt, shame are very common. And because of that incident, you have a diminished interest in doing things. Let's say you were someone who went to church a lot, or someone who was an avid hunter. You might find yourself doing less and less of that because you're not getting much pleasure or interest in wanting to do those things. You also might feel more isolated and detached from others. And you might have a hard time feeling positive emotions. Like you can't really feel true happiness or satisfaction or even loving feelings because of the stressor of what's you've gone through. Next slide. And finally, as if with a DSM, you have to have rule out stuff, but also with the PTSD, you have to have some kind of alterations in your reactivity or arousal. By 2 or more, you have to be irritable or have angry outbursts with no provocation. It could be, I call them adult temper tantrums. I think we're all guilty of this to some degree or another, but it doesn't mean we have PTSD. But you know, sometimes we have a bad day and we get a little irritated with people. Self-destructive behavior or reckless behavior. This is people coming back and they, after a horrific experience like Surfside, they'll do things like drive too fast, like 120 miles an hour, or they'll drink excessive, or do drugs, or something kind of self-destructive behavior. I know in the Army, when we kicked back from Iraq, they made sure that we weren't allowed to drive a car for 2 weeks because they were afraid of all the people who were dying in car accidents, kind of coming back and driving very fast. People might have an exaggerated startle response, problems concentrating, or again, sleeping. So, and the duration of this stuff has to happen more than 1 month. Now, if it occurs less than 1 month, these symptoms, it's called an acute stress reaction. It's not PTSD, but after 1 month, it actually meets the criteria of time for being diagnosed with PTSD. Next slide. You're frozen. Look, there we go. So I was also doing and thanks, that one, there we go. So, and finally, in the DSM, you have to have rule out. So PTSD symptoms aren't caused by some kind of thing like medicine or alcohol or another medical condition that might attribute to the anxiety and sleep disturbance. And the disturbance, whatever you have, is the symptoms from PTSD, the anxiety, causes a significant distress or impairment in your social life, your occupational duties, or other areas. So you might become a homebody and not socialize as much. Those are all normal signs for people with PTSD. Next slide. So again, Dave Benedict came up with this Venn diagram to talk about how mental illness, behavior changes, and your subclinical responses all kind of come together. So subclinical responses, we're talking about problems, sleeping, fear, worry, or not concentrating as well. But mental health and illness, resilience is part of it. But that's where you get more PTSD or acute stress reaction, acute stress disorder, or depression. And then you have behavior changes to deal with the stress. So smoking, evacuating the area or hiding away, drinking too much, and sometimes over dedication, meaning immersing yourself in work and duties. Sometimes a lot of people love to work harder or work longer hours because while they're working, they don't have to think about the feelings they have. Next slide. So looking through the research, the literature out there, I came across that the Congress actually had a memo. They had researchers who knew, but Congressional Research Office actually said that in the federal government's role is to take a piecemeal approach to first responder mental health initiatives. So a more coordinated approach could include more comprehensive mental health care prevention and treatment. This might include attention to the course of mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery. Now, with all the reading on this, I read the whole thing, and basically the way I took it is the government is aware of a problem, but they're doing a piecemeal approach, which means they're waiting for us to kind of help take care of ourselves too. So that's another impetus for the study, is for us to try to figure out what's the best way to help take care of the first responders. That's like, okay, I'm going to turn it back to Natasha for the next slide.
Thanks, Chris. That was a great overview on mental health in the first responders. And so as we start talking about the pilot study, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, this really came about after the collapse at Surfside in June of 2021. We know that more than 80 Miami-Dade County and City of Miami Fire Rescue Units responded to the initial building collapse, and then subsequently following, there were several task force that came and assisted, including members from all over the state of Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, as well as internationally. There were members from Israel that came to assist with the urban search and rescue of the Champlain Towers. And so during this this tragedy, University of Miami and the FCI team, many of the scientists went out to assist with exposure. So actual physical exposure, looking at the ambient air that was around these firefighters as well as the community. And so during that time, we also got feedback from our firefighters, a little bit after, about looking at, overall physical and mental experiences of these firefighters. And so this is where we started to write the protocol toward the end of last year. And so the purpose of this pilot study was really to learn through the collection of qualitative data. So through in-depth interviews and focus groups from our USAR firefighters on their mental health concerns that they may experience due to the performance of their duties in any urban and search and rescue scenes. So eligibility, inclusion criteria was pretty straightforward. Any firefighter that was part of an urban search and rescue team that was 18 years or older and was able to fluently speak, write, and read in English. So this was a national study that we opened it up. We've hosted everything through Zoom. So I'll take you through a little bit of study procedures. So we did qualitative interviews and focus groups. We included a demographic survey to really understand who our sample that we were interviewing was. So, including demographic information, race, ethnicity, but also looking at years of service, years as USAR member, and everything was conducted virtually. So as I mentioned, we did have a national sample. So representatives from all over the country that have participated in some of these focus groups. We have not done any focus groups since Hurricane Ian. So we were actively enrolling and conducting these focus groups. And then we put a hold on it once Hurricane Ian happened. We knew a lot of people were deployed, and our plan is to start again. I know that there are still people or USAR task force members that are still out there helping the west coast of Florida. So our plan is to wait a little bit longer until we reconvene doing the focus groups. So here is just a snapshot of our focus group scripts. And so when we create these, we really start, you call it kind of an upside down cone, where we start very broad and then move very distinct to what our research question is. So as you can see here, we start out on overall mental health availability in the fire service. So not specific to a USAR member, talking about their family and mental health. And then we go into the question specifically about USAR. A lot of this, and this is very much how most of our studies have been conducted since 2015, as far as collecting formative work. So as I mentioned, this is our first time really working with USAR members. So you can see questions about USAR concerns. We really wanted to know, what is a day in of a deployment, and what happens? What are your tasks? What goes into it? What happens with family life? What happens while you're there? What are your most concerns physically, mentally, emotionally while you're there, what resources are there. And then we talk about challenges and, what outlook they have. We also ask questions about, what was their thoughts and experiences about reaching out for mental health care and just overall thought on that from an organizational standpoint, as well as an individual experience. And so here you can see we've interviewed right now 17 firefighters of a mean age of 44 years old, an average tenure of 21 years in the fire service. We had 15 males and 2 females. We have a breakdown here of the rankings. So our largest was lieutenant of 23%, followed by captains of 17%, and assistant chiefs, as well as those who identify as just firefighters. We had representation from leadership, so chief, assistant chief, some who identified as a deputy chief, medical team manager, and a firefighter rescue specialist. So we thought this was important to show, because you'll see with some of our findings from our qualitative themes, it really impacted the type of stress that a firefighter reported was based on their ranking and how it changed in their years and tenure. Okay, I'm frozen again. Give me 1 second. It should load up again. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that. I don't know why my computer keeps freezing. So here you can see the qualitative findings. So as many of you know, when conducting qualitative research, what we're doing is we're asking open-ended questions from the participants to really get some rich data of their experiences. So not what you would get from a survey where you would get yes or no answers. And so the main themes that came out of here is really, main concerns of our firefighters that we interviewed. So one of the main themes was overall health and safety. And some of the sub themes that came out of that were that deployments are mentally and physically challenging, which we know. The immediate concern was the mission and the safety of crew members, as well as family at home. They did mention how this does change depending on the type of disaster. So for instance, if you are deployed to a hurricane, but it's also a hurricane that is coming toward your home, that adds an extra stress. But they did say they count on and rely on their firefighter coworkers, who usually step up and help their family members if they know that they're deployed for that type of mission. They also mentioned long-term concerns. So overall mental health triggers, PTSD, cancer risk, and life after retirement. So it seemed that many of the firefighters that were also urban search and rescue were people that were very much into the job and wanted to stay as involved as possible. And this is probably why they have the second task of being on a USAR task force. And so one of the main concerns was really what to do after retirement. And then diminish mental health resources for those USAR members who are in leadership positions. And so this was something that really came out in the themes, was that specifically with Surfside, firefighters mentioned that they did see a lot of mental health resources and people there. They said that there was therapy dogs and people there who were saying, are you willing to talk and sit down and have a small group? And they said the resources were definitely there. However, they do feel that if they're in a leadership position, that it's not something that they should take advantage of at the time, because they feel like their main mission and goal of that time is to make sure that their crew is okay and that everyone gets out safely. They also, a lot of things that came out of it was that Surfside was a different animal compared to all of the other deployments that many of them had been on. So it was very different because of the length and time, and just the way that the deployment was set up. The next main theme that we took out of this was discussion on USAR training. So one thing that we picked up on that we were asking the USAR members on was, what were the requirements and what training was required to become a USAR member. And so many of them, explained to us the process, passing the different tests and taking the different trainings. However, when we asked them if there was any discussion or any modules that they discussed mental health as a long-term effect, or if there was discussion on, possible things that they would see. And so they said, no, it was, maybe an instructor would give them that information, like you may see, or you will see dead bodies, you are doing a search and rescue. But it was more of tactical information and not so much of how to deal with those things during and after a deployment. And then also the awareness of potential mental health concerns is needed. So for one example, one of the firefighters explained that, he was having feelings after, and a lot of what Chris was describing as PTSD. However, he thought it was only happening to him because no one had really discussed what type of things could possibly happen after being on a deployment. So those were really the main things that came out in regards to training. And then the last theme we saw is resources. So for some members, they found it challenging to find resources specific to it, really depend on their department. It depended on geographically where they were located, and overall what the acceptance of mental health care and resources, what it was considered. So they found it challenging. Peer support and mental health assistance is becoming more accepted in the fire service. So again, as I mentioned, many of them said that when they were at Surfside, they saw the most mental health outreach that they've seen prior to that. So they said they are seeing change, and they are seeing that it is being accepted. But as we see in the sub-theme ahead before it, that it still is challenging, and it really depends on where you live and what type of department you're from. And then specialized USAR mental health services for, as we mentioned, depending on what your rank and what your role is. So basically, depending on what your role is, if you're on the front line, if you're in a leadership position, if you're a retiree, and even so, firefighters really brought up a good point that there's other task force members that are not firefighters, that are engineers that have to make decisions, that are physicians that are there on site. And so really specializing in creating some type of resources that is really tailored to specific roles and rankings of not only firefighters, but other members that may be on the task force. And so here, as I mentioned, with qualitative, our data that is our follow-up of our themes is our supporting quotations. And so here are some quotations that I thought really stuck out that support some of our main themes. So as far as me, I'm personally noticed my anxiety has gotten worse. My mom has noticed, but I'm kind of doing my own thing to cope with it. So this is something that we saw pretty often, or people realize that after certain deployments, they were very weary about doing certain things, going on an elevator, going certain heights in a building, seeing different, water or types of building. It really depended on the person. Hearing different sounds triggered. And so a lot of times we see things like this where they believe and they identify that their anxiety has gotten worse. However, they're just trying to take care of it on their own. Another quote we saw was, stress is always on the job. I'm always looking at the next step, plan B, C, or D. If this happens, what can we do here? if this happens, what do we do here? And that has created issues with me and my wife. And so there are other things, some of those that were interviewed said, some of the stress has caused issues in family. Many others said, they've only gone through certain types of experiences because of the support of their family. But again, we have heard that a lot of times they don't want to bring home the stories back to their family. So it's something that they would hold in. One person believed that with mental health in the fire department, it will take decades for mental health stigma to go away. They also said, I think what maintains the mental health is the camaraderie, and the common ground is spending that time together on shift. So this was another common thing we saw, that they really do rely on each other and talking with each other. But we do see a shift in that depending on their ranking, so a chief really has a hard time, I guess, finding someone because they are the chief or the captain or the assistant chief, and they feel that they're in a leadership role. The last quotation I'll highlight here is a challenge in the firehouse or even outside the house for me is when you're the senior guy with rank and everybody comes to you, you're supposed to be the tough guy. You are the shoulder they lean on. Where do the top guys go for help? So again, this is something that had come up pretty often in our interviews. So moving on to our future directions and next steps and where we want to take this. As I mentioned, this was just a pilot, qualitative and really formative work for us to just get an idea of what firefighters are experiencing and what they saw as priorities. So one we saw was the training aspect. And so one of our plans is to create some educational modules similar to what we've done with cancer prevention, but really focusing on mental health for these task force members, incorporating this education during their initial training. So they're aware of things that they may see and how it may impact them in the short term and the long term, and really just starting that conversation. So there is, the stigma is lowered. And then, as I mentioned, tailoring the education to our USAR task force members based on their role and ranking. So beyond just the firefighters who are on the front lines and what they may see, but also the chiefs that are in charge or the captains, or also an engineer or a physician, anyone who's there on site that may see things, smell, hear things that would trigger things long term. And lastly, anything that we do in the future, we'd like to partner with other fire service organizations that are studying mental health of firefighters to incorporate these training changes. So we know that the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative is doing some amazing work in the space of mental health, working with UCF and UCF Restores. So it is a partnership that we'd love to continue. And as that's where we're at with future directions. Chris, before we move on to questions, anything else you'd love to add related to our pilot data?
No, I mean, I think the one thing I'd like to add, and this might be something that we need to discuss about in the future where we go. Like you mentioned, a lot of people really rely on the camaraderie of going to their workplace to be with other people who've been in a similar situation or experienced the same thing, and that gives them a sense of a way to cope with it and deal with it. They're there for each other, which is wonderful. The problem is when we were talking to people and we're talking about what are you going to do when retirement comes up, a lot of people didn't want to talk about retirement because, and my concern is once you retire, you might not have that same support system you do now. So that seemed to be something that was common too. A lot of people didn't want to discuss the retirement word. But other than that, I mean, this is what we've come up with, and I'd like to hear from all of you on USAR and the departments to see what you think. I mean, are we on target, or is there anything you'd like to see? I guess I'll turn it over for questions. Any questions?
I don't see anything in the chat or in the QA. So if anyone, oh, here comes one.
PTSD.
So in the question, there are pretty good treatments for PTSD. Did you get a sense of how many were being treated for PTSD?
I don't think we got a good sense of how many were being treated for PTSD per se, but we did get a sense. Some people are in therapy. Now, we didn't delve into what they're in therapy for. You know, I can assume some of them are in there for their experiences, but you know, it was more, you know, what I did see is a lot of people were reporting all the symptoms of the DSM-5 criteria of PTSD. So there were a lot of people having irritability. There were a lot of people having insomnia. There were a lot of people who were avoiding doing things, or they've changed what they do, meaning they avoid situations like going to parking garages came up as one answer because of the structural collapse possibility of those. So things like that, it was like no one actually said they had PTSD, but they were definitely exhibiting some signs and symptoms. So I think that's pretty much, would you agree, Natasha?
Yeah, and you know, I think it's a really good question, and you know, in the qualitative work, we're really just asking about their experiences, and we didn't ask this type of question in the survey, which could be helpful later on in a future intervention. So thank you for bringing it up.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I don't see any other questions coming through. We thank you guys so much for joining us today. We're excited about this work. We're hoping it grows more and more interest from the fire service. Please reach out if you have any questions whatsoever related to this subject or anything related to FCI. You can reach out to myself or anyone in the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. Oh, hold on, we do have a question. How do doctors differentiate symptoms of PTSD and brain trauma? Maybe not from firefighters, but maybe for the military.
Good question. There are some similarities. People who have, some people call it CTE for NFL players. Some people call it TBI, traumatic brain injury. Whatever you call it, you know, there is some evidence that when, you know, people have personality changes, often if the TBI they have is severe enough. They measure it by how long were you unconscious for and your memory. But it is possible for somebody to have mood changes and become suicidal or become moody or angry outbursts. Very similar to PTSD. Best way I can say to differentiate it is just gives them a really good history and physical and assessment. For the TBI, they might do brain studies and EEGs and things like that. In addition to looking at the history, and PTSD, they're also going to look at history. So there's a lot of things that blend together when it comes to mental health. So it's unlike other parts of medicine where, you know, someone has low potassium and you give them a pill and their potassium comes back up. Mental health is a lot grayer. So there's a lot of rule out diagnoses, and that's usually how we diagnose that. Good question.
Great, thank you. Okay, so with that, I think we're at the end. So again, thank you guys so much. I'll hand it over to Tara to close us out.
Yeah, thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. So our next seminar series will be on November 30th at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. It will be on the findings from the Surfside assessment of first responder exposures. This will be presented by Dr. Shanta Dar and Alex Stewart from our Occupational and Environmental Carcinogen Exposure Program. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And that is it. Have a good day, everyone.